thank you so much to Joel and Yona and everyone who helped make the show a reality. And a huge thank you to the artists, because without them we'd have no exhibition. And thank you all for coming. It was really interesting to work on this exhibit with Joel and Joshua, because Joshua is a one-man comic machine and Joel is the perfect mix of fine art and comics. And I dabble more in fine art, so together we make a really balanced team, and I think the exhibit reflects that really nicely, and is a wonderful mix of comics and fine arts, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. And thank you all so much for coming.
Well, I want to thank Fred, Yona, Joel, and Goldie for being such great curators. Like we've all said before, this is a great exhibition that merges the influences of fine arts and comics and where they intersect. Really, ideally, you'd like to have Lichtenstein in here, you'd like to have Andy Warhol, because that's kind of where you're getting to, the stuff that was street art that's now become everywhere. Penny industry, I think Joe Simon told me it was a sticky dime industry, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. My part in it is I make a book called Israeli Defense Comics. I always wanted to see a Jewish superhero. I used to watch a lot of films with my dad, Three Stooges, Marx Brothers, stuff like that. And when I was a little kid, he's like, you know, they're all Jewish. You know, that he would laugh at something. Like, what was that? Oh, it was in Yiddish, which I didn't know. What I didn't speak Yiddish. And then when I started finding out, oh, Bob Kane, the creator of Batman, oh, that's not really his name. It's Robert Kahan, or you get Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. You get Jack Kirby or Max Finkelstein. It was Carl Burgos who created the Human Torch. All these 1940s characters that all dealt with Nazism during that time, which was a relevant event. And for me, none of them created a Jewish superhero. And it wasn't until 1980s where you really started to see any kind of Jewish stuff in comics. And it usually was somebody in Marvel and DC walked around with a magical brush and said, Adam is now Jewish, the Thing is now Jewish, Magneto is now Jewish. And boom, everybody was, all of a sudden there were Jewish characters, but nobody was actually created to be a Jewish character. And of these couple of characters, no one had their own comic book. So there really wasn't a representation of Jewish stuff in comics, unless it was the Christmas special with the one page that was Hanukkah. Or like, some terrible thing happens where somebody dies and finally the person says Kaddish. And then that was the big reveal. Or there was a Holocaust story, but anything outside of that wasn't talked about. So when I created Israeli Defense Comics in 2012, when I released the first issue, I was going back to the 1940s stuff and talking about what was important today, which to me was terrorism, but was also about things about Israel, and it needed to be talked about that hadn't been. So I think I've talked for too long, but if you'd like to see my book, it's on the table, and of course the third issue comes out on Sunday, so you can see what I did.
I had been showing at fairly decent galleries from a fairly young age, and it didn't occur to me as remarkable that the entire art world as I knew it was substantially Jewish. The critics, the dealers, and many artists at the time in the late 60s or so. And I received a commission to do murals in an Orthodox synagogue, B'nai Yosef, which Joel referred to. And I realized that after I did the menorah and the Magen David, there was no Jewish iconography for me to draw on. And I had to invent it, which meant that I had to stop and study and figure out what in fact could be depicted and still remain kosher to the Orthodox community. And that got me started on a roll. I was the only guy in the country that had the kashrut to do that. Reb Moshe Weinstein, who okayed that project, passed away soon after. So I walked around with this seal of approval. And I started to do a lot of Jewish commissions for the worldwide Jewish community while I was maintaining a secular profile. And in 1984, I did these exterior murals at Michlala, the Jerusalem Women's Teachers College, based on the 7 Days of Creation, for which I studied every piece of Midrash I could get my hands on and threw literally hundreds of pieces of iconography into it. And my problem was, when I finished that I realized I was dealing with an iconoclastic community, which is the Jewish community, and I was Jewish, and I was an artist. So basically asking for rabbinic approval for a visual item was sort of counterproductive. So at that point I decided that the visual had to be primary and take precedence over the verbal, which is not a kosher thing to do, but I decided that's really what had to be done in order to manifest a Jewish art. So when I came back from Mechlala, I was still had the Jewish identity that was based on Mad Magazine, Danny Kaye, Sid Caesar, that kind of thing. In 1974, when Blazing Saddles came out, it seemed okay to be a wise guy Jew in the national eye. And I started to do a series of cartoon-like rabbis. I don't know whether that was in response to all the mishigas I got from the previous critiques, but they were put in the Jewish Museum in a show, and I found myself standing next to Art Spiegelman, and we became very close. We sort of hit it off that night. And I realized there was a whole thing I could engage in, realizing that people like Will Eisner were in fact very staunch in their public Jewishness. As a kid, I was not allowed to read comic books unless they were classics illustrated, and I never developed a real affection for comics in the sense that this show mostly emphasizes. But in camp, when kids would have like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, I thought that was cool, and the reason was because I thought they were drawn better. I mean, it really had nothing to do with Superman or Batman. But in retrospect, I realized that Superman and Batman, as is well documented, are assimilative characters. In fact, I was looking at that Bob Kane print over there and realized that Batman and Robin are kind of this Yale University Goyish ideal, and the characters that they're attacking, which are the enemies, are dressed and act like the caricatures usually ascribed to Jews in anti-Semitic propaganda. That is, if you look at the drawings of the Joker and the guy in the top hat and stuff, it looks like Nazi pictures of Jews. And I thought there's a kind of, reverse, there's a serious begging to, as Clem Greenberg would have us do, to disappear into the fabric of non-Jewish identity. So Art hooked me up with Will Eisner and Maurice Sendak, who were very strong in their Yiddishkeit. And this particular painting is from '85, a year after. It's the same year as the rabbis, in fact. And I did a series of paintings based on cities that became Judenrein after the war, a lot of European cities. And the character on the left is from a Walt Disney character, and I was simply making notice of Walt Disney's famous anti-Semitism.
So I'm a little bit atypical here because I'm coming from the writing part of it. I am, my experience with the Jewish Art Salon is mostly as a photographer. I guess one of my first solo exhibition in New York was in 2005. And if there's kind of like a leitmotif, it's like the diversity of the Jewish experience. I had several exhibitions dealing really with diversity in Judaism. But also I feel like the other thing is that I'm a storyteller. I mean, my photography tells stories, often asks questions, challenges the audience, and I more or less stumbled through my photography into the graphic novel scene. So in 2010, I was doing a series on former gang leaders from the South Bronx, and one of them who I photographed turned out to be not only essential in the gang truths that led to hip-hop in the South Bronx, but also he was a crypto Jew. And we became friends. Sometimes you make in New York strange friends. And I got fascinated by his story, by his life story, which at that time, everybody I interviewed, there were a lot of hip-hop pioneers, knew it because they all grew up in the same neighborhood. And but it was something that really had a strange appeal for me as someone who deals with identity questions. And so I spent way too much time with him and knew way too much about his life. And I, at that time, reconnected with an illustrator, Claudia Allering, and she had illustrated in 1998. I did a bilingual edition of Yiddish poetry from the Warsaw Ghetto that she illustrated for me. And we, through like social media, reconnected after like decades. And I told her this idea that I met this guy. I have no idea how to do a graphic novel, but I think it would work wonderfully. And the book came out 3 years ago. I just want to, it's a bit small, but you can see the picture that ended up in my solo exhibition in 2011, where he is wrapped in a talit, and he's holding a picture of himself as a young man. it really became a surprising success. It was translated to 5 languages. I found an agent who encouraged me to do more graphic novels. And when I was doing this, I actually, being insecure about working in a medium that I'm not familiar with, I really started to study everything about like comics. And was fascinated. What I wasn't really aware is that like the American comic book history is actually Jewish history. As we mentioned before, of course, many of the pioneers were comic book artists, were Jewish in the comic artists, publishers, editors. I mean, it was a whole field, and it had to do, of course, with discrimination. I mean, as a Jew in the 1930s and 40s, it was very hard to get in this field into, for example, advertisement. So in a way, what my next book that's coming out officially May 15th, and maybe if we're lucky, we have some copies on Sunday, is really the madman of comics. It is the history of the American comic book industry, and like Ghetto Brother. So Ghetto Brother is, I mean, all the books have like several layers of stories. So on the one hand, it's like the story of a gang truce. Then it's a wider story about urban decay, but also it's a coming of age story. So the Joe Shuster book is in a way the story about the creation of Superman. It's a story about the friendship of 2 young guys who meet in Cleveland. But it's also the wider story about the American comic book industry, the challenges, I mean, the 1950 trials that had very strong anti-Semitic undertones, and really like how Jews created the whole industry. And Jews and Italians, I have to say, because these were the 2 groups that were discriminated against, but also because they lived in the proximity of the Lower East Side often. So there was this proximity of 2 groups that just supported each other. And it's often forgotten that a lot of if they were not Jewish, they most likely were Italians in this. So so I'm very excited to be here at the Jewish Comic Con on Sunday. And yeah, it's another form of storytelling that I think in the last 10, 15 years finds more and more appreciation. And also, interesting enough, I feel like the identity politics that Joel mentioned, that with Ghetto Brother, I was invited to the African American Comic Con, I was invited to the Latino Comic Con, and I ended up also in the Jewish Comic Con. So I think there is like this emergence of like this specified comic conventions, but identity politics are fluid, and they also always end. So it's not just because the book has a Jewish content, it's also like a Latino content, African American content. And I think that's a fascination for me about New York that I try to explore as an artist. Thank you.
It's great to be last. Firstly, I'd like to ask a personal request, because this is a convention of geeks and freaks. If people could withhold any spoilers from Avengers Infinity War, that would be appreciated. Also, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe becomes perhaps the most successful export in maybe in the history of America, it seems interesting, coming from immigrant Jews as an assimilation archetype, that we should be sitting here at Avengers Weekend talking about Jews and comics. I'll give you my spiel. I'll try. I'm a rabbi, but I'll keep it to 5. But I did not grow up Hasidic, religious, observant, Orthodox. I grew up normal. I'm from Manchester, England, and I was promised a post-bar mitzvah growth spurt that never happened. I'm still waiting, and I was bullied mercilessly. I remember the first day of high school, and I had I was given an atomic wedgie. That's a Talmudic term, and I learned 3 things in high school. I kind of learned that if you're funny, the cool kids like you more, the bullies bully you less, and the girls, 2 out of 3, I think is very respectable. And I think really I sort of tapped into the Jewish storytelling tradition that, as Mel Brooks says, if you have the last laugh, you win even when you lose. Many years later, I became the rabbi of Pratt Institute, and as Elka Riva Sudin, who's here today, a dear sister of mine, can tell you that when I first became the rabbi of Pratt, I tried all the traditional rabbinic shtick, Sabbath, kosher, holiday. I still try, Fred, but students would say to me, Rabbi, you're a great guy, you're funny, charismatic, good looking, whatever. But this is art school. So I started to really talk about the synthesis of theology and the arts. I wrote my first book, Up, Up, and Oy Vey, which was really a direct collaboration over copious bowls of chicken soup with Saul at Friday night as a way to connect to students. And I found myself, this was really before the movies started to gain traction. I started going to conventions, and I remember meeting Jerry Robinson, who created the Joker, who created so much of Batman, by the way, without getting the credit or the credibility that he deserved. And he told me these incredible stories. He told me the Joker was conceived in Grossinger's kosher resort in the Catskills. This incredible, this indelible influence on this incredible American art form. You know, the superhero really is almost a Jewish invention. They say if a person's name ends in man, they're either Jewish, Lippman, Feldman, Goldman, or a superhero, Superman's. I'm not even going to finish that. But if you look at, and I'll end with this, the front cover of Captain America #1, which is actually the first superhero to openly engage in the war. And I was so appreciative that Stan Lee personally gave me permission to use this image in the book. And there's been a lot of thank yous tonight, maybe too many thank yous tonight, but I will add that, Yona, you are the Stan Lee of the Jewish fine art world, and we love you. You see that the front cover, it's the first superhero to openly engage in the war. Here you have Captain America. You'll notice the shield slightly different, smacking Hitler across the face. You know, it's funny, it's cute, it's nostalgic. Could you imagine coming from immigrant Jews who were getting retching letters home from their family in the old country? What a powerful portrayal of wish fulfillment this must have been. And really, there's nothing more American than Captain America. He's the flag embellished as costume. Superman, he's apple pie, he's Coke, he's Rockwell. But really, they're not really all American. They're in fact the wish fulfillment of what it means to be all American, coming from immigrant Jews who wanted to be all American, if that makes sense. And the wish fulfillment was so beautiful that America adopted the fantasy as reality. It's the same in fashion, film, photography, comedy, shtick shift. Got to be careful how you say that. I made a terrible error once on NPR. I got bleeped. I believe the argument could really be made that the superhero and perhaps the American dream is a Jewish invention and assimilation archetype. And it's such knowing that Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, went to Pratt and left after one day because he couldn't afford tuition, how times have not changed, how much nachas he must be getting right now in superhero heaven. Thank you so much.